Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Strategies for Uncovering Black Women's Voices in Primary Sources, which is sponsored by ProQuest, part of Clarivate. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our presenter. We do expect many questions and we likely will have time to get to all of them, so we apologize in advance. But that being said, we'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end. So please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions that you like. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Barbara Olson, who will moderate today's Q&A.
Thank you, Sabrina. Hello, everybody. My name is Barb Olson. I am the Marketing Director for Primary Sources and Historical Collections at ProQuest, which is now part of Clarivate. I'm really thrilled today. I'm glad you all could attend. I think this is going to be an hour well spent for you. We're pleased to present to you Dr. Ashley Farmer, who's at UT Austin. She's going to be talking today about some of the strategies she's used in her research and teaching and how she's using primary sources. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I think we have a pretty big crowd, so I'm excited to share a little bit about the kind of work I do, the research that I do, and perhaps how we can help students do this as well. So I think I need to get control of the screen. Okay, all right, there we go. So I just want to start out with a little bit of background about who I am and what I do, what kinds of research questions that I ask. So I am a historian of Black women's history, specifically history of Black women engaged in radical politics, largely throughout the 20th century, but more specifically in the late 20th century with the Black Power movement. And within that, I'm especially interested in Black women's intellectual history. So certainly I want to know what Black women did, but I also want to know what they said or what they thought. And in particular, I'm interested in thinking about how they looked around the world, saw the issues that were taking place with racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, and how they produced analyses that might make for a different world. And this is a little bit different of a research kind of adventure than simply just kind of chronologically going through what it is that they did, although it is equally as important. So today, the two questions that I want to talk about and get into more detail about are the two animating questions of my own research. The first of those is, how does one locate and analyze Black women's intellectual production? And I mean locate and analyze certainly in traditional archives, but also just kind of out in the world in the ether and also in digital spaces. And then my second question is, how do 20th century Black women radicals shape past and present understandings of politics and liberation and equality? And here you can see how these conversations go together. I'm interested in finding out what were their thoughts about the world, what were their analyses of the world. And then I'm interested in thinking about the influence of those thoughts and those analyses in our world today. So these two animating questions were the start of my first book, which was Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era, which was published in 2017. And this is an intellectual history of Black women during the Black Power movement. But what's interesting, and what a lot of people don't know about when I wrote this book, is it originally came out of my dissertation. And when I proposed writing a book, not just about what Black women did, but what they said and what they thought, I was told that it was not possible. Now, nobody was saying that it wasn't possible in the sense that I couldn't do it. No one was saying it wasn't possible in the sense that it wasn't a good project to take on. But there were really real questions about whether or not I could find enough in the archive to sustain a book of this kind of sustained measure or caliber, right? The thought was that sexism had overrode Black women's ability to really engage in the movement. And on top of that, we hadn't really developed the correct archival practices to catalog Black women's ideas, if in fact they were there. So there were really real questions about this. And I had to rethink what archiving meant and what evidence meant in order to make that happen. So I want to talk you through a couple of examples of how, whoops, let me go back there. How I found, sorry guys, I'm not sure what's happening here. Black women's intellectualism in the archive. Sorry, let me go back here. It seems to be getting ahead of me. There we go. And talk about some of the examples that developed from this particular book. So the first example that you see right here, this Many Others in History, A Conversation from Life, is actually satire written by a Black woman named Alice Childress in the 1950s. The book that I completed covers from the 1940s to the 1980s and charts the rise and fall of the Black Power movement. So most people said, you know, there isn't really any real evidence of Black women talking about things that are central to Black Power, like community control, self-determination, and self-defense. But I found that that was in fact the case, but we had to look in different places. And one of them being in the forms and formats that were available to Black women. So in the 1940s and 1950s, was Alice Childress able to be the head of an organization? No, she was not, right? Even though she was a prolific activist. Was she able to be given space to write long treatises that are published? No, she wasn't. But she was able to get a little column in the Baltimore African American about Black women domestic workers. And Black women domestic workers were a sizable portion of the Black organizing population. Before 1965, if you were a Black woman, you likely worked as a domestic worker at some point, if not your entire life. So this group, this column, A Conversation from Life, is a serialized of conversations between Mildred, the main character, a domestic worker, and her friend Marge, who she comes home and recounts every day her experiences moving about Harlem and also working in white women's homes. So what is really funny, actually, piece of satire, and the way they kind of banter back and forth is hilarious. But embedded in that is Marge and Mildred talking about what it means to be a Black woman in the world, their assessments of things like South African apartheid or African liberation movements, and what they think Black people should be doing in Harlem in order to assert their self-determination and Black cultural pride. And so here was an example, even though it didn't necessarily look like quote unquote intellectual production, of Black women articulating ideas and spreading ideas. So that's how I got it, that kind of in that earlier period. Now, as many of you know, by the time that we get to the 1960s and 70s, there are plenty of Black women that are engaged in large scale organizing, and nowhere probably more so or more visible than the Black Panther Party. And these two examples that you see here, this one and this one here, are examples from the Black Panther Party. Now, when most people think about the Black Panther Party, they think about, you know, Huey Newton and kind of the chair with a spear and a gun, or perhaps they think about, you know, Black men in black leather jackets, Black berets, and sunglasses. And while some people may know that Black women were there, we usually think about them as more high-profile women, like Kathleen Neal Cleaver, or sometimes Angela Davis, who was friends with the Panthers, but never actually a member of the Panther Party, is associated with it. So the question then for me was, how do I get at what Black women who chose to be in the Black Panther Party thought about the world? What were their politics? How did they express their politics? How did they try to shape the world around them? And certainly they didn't have the same kind of forums as, say, a Huey Newton or an Eldridge Cleaver. But one of the main things they did do was develop art for the newspaper, the Black Panther. And the art that you see here, these two images, are from a woman named Gail Dixon. And Gail Dixon was a rank and file member. She was a member of the Seattle chapter. And many people probably would not know her in any real sense unless perhaps she studied the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party. But she created tons and tons of images in which she was both propagandizing for the Black Panther Party, you know, really expressing their views, but also centering women in them, as you see. And you see a range of women here, from this younger woman who has a free food bag and a Bobby Seale for mayor thing over here. And then over here, another free food bag. And then it says, let it shine, let the power of the people shine. And this is a little bit more difficult to see right here, but this woman from the quote is saying, yes, I'm against the war in Vietnam. I'm for African liberation, voter registration, and the people's survival. So I read things like this in the book to talk about how Black women not only started to attribute to a set of ideologies or politics that was developed by the Black Panther Party, but also how they transformed it and applied it to Black women in their community, right? These are the women that you see here that Dixon is centering, don't look anything like the prototypical Panther, but instead they are saying that these are women that express these politics, and so too can you, right? Express those politics, Black woman who is reading this Black Panther newspaper. Okay. So in order to find these kinds of images, I really had to rethink a lot of my training as a historian, right? There were many times when I overlooked things that were in plain sight because I was taught that evidence of intellectual production looked a certain way. And I really had to go back to the same sources and recover some of the same sources that people had looked at time and time again to find the kind of evidence I was looking for. And I want to just offer you 2 examples here. So one issue that I brought up when I said that it was questioning whether I could complete this book was whether or not Black power sexism overdetermined Black women's organizing and left them without any sort of intellectual production. And no place was that more probably a question or an issue than this group here called the Congress of African People. This group was a cultural nationalist group, meaning, and part of their ideology was to prescribe to very patriarchal, what we would now deem very sexist understanding of men's and women's roles. So there had been virtually nothing written about these Black women and their thoughts. The assumption is that they blindly accepted the sexism as part of being in this group. However, one place that people had often overlooked was the women's columns and women's handbooks. And they're holding up right here an example of their handbook. So why this is such kind of a rich find in the archive is that most people overlooked it because it's called the Nationalist Women's Handbook. And if you open the first page or the second page, all you see is a recapitulation of what the men in the organization say women's roles are. So I think most historians just kind of moved on past it. But if you flip a couple more pages, all of a sudden the entire tone of the handbook switches and they talk about and deconstruct everything that the men in the organization are saying, you know, it's nice that we think that women should do this. It's nice that we think women should do that. But in reality, we are in the middle of a struggle for liberation and Black women need to be involved in all kinds of different things, right? And so you can see how they even understood that if you just use the first couple of pages to kind of kowtow to the patriarchy, many people would skip over it. And then in the back of the book, they totally subvert everything that the teachings of the organization says, right? So that's a perfect example of something that people often overlooked, but turned out to be kind of a landmine in thinking about how Black women were shaping this movement for themselves. Another example is the Black Panther newspaper. Again, like I said, it probably is the most mined newspaper because it went around the world and really offered a window into a lot of what the Black Panther Party was thinking. So in some of these pages, you might find something like this called A Message to Revolutionary Women. This is an article written by a woman named Candy Robinson, and she was a member of the Southern California chapter. So in contrast to the paintings or the images that I showed from Gail Dixon, there were plenty of instances in which Black women in the Panther Party, rank and file members, wrote. And so when you kind of open it and look at the beginning, it looks a little bit, again, like she's kind of kowtowing to what men say women's kind of subsidiary roles should be. But as you keep moving through this and many of the other articles, we see Black women then using this as a way to say, you know, that's all nice and good to think about these roles in these ways, but in reality, we have to have a more expansive understanding of liberation, right? So for me personally, this required going back to the archive and looking at things that I'd already passed over with a new eye towards thinking, what forms and formats are Black women able to have at their disposal at this point? And how do they kind of navigate this line of understanding that they can't totally go outside of the confines of patriarchy, but also trying to assert a little bit of things for themselves. And this is the nuts and bolts of what became Remaking Black Power. So I want to pause here and talk about how I might share with students how to mimic this in their own works, projects, research papers, dissertations, etc. And I think this really has to come from a moment of real world observation. So I have them start a journal. It can be either an actual physical piece of paper with columns, or it can be a, an online journal, a Google Doc, anything of the sort. But it needs to have two separate parts. Part one is for real world observation. And I ask them for a week between classes, typically, to keep a journal where they write down on one side how they see ideas about Black women being promulgated around the world around them. So this means I ask them to look at YouTube videos. I ask them to look at TV commercials. I ask them to look at news reports. I ask them to scroll through Twitter and Facebook and say, when do you see an image of a Black woman? Does it match the article, right? Or the text that is being promulgated about that Black woman, right? And then the second side or second column or second page is, where do they see Black women promulgating ideas about themselves, right? So it's one thing to say, what are ideas about Black women being put out in the world today? Where do you see them? Where do those happen? And the second is, how do Black women today take control of their own narrative and put out ideas about themselves and about the world around them, akin to what I was talking about with Dixon or with Childress, as I showed in the book. So that's part one. We take about a week to do that. And then they come back to class one of the next weeks, and we do part two, which is matching the observation and the archive. So I usually have students just go around and share their observations. And we, as a class, we talk about how we might find primary sources to represent their observations. So if you imagine me at the front with kind of a bulletin board or a whiteboard, I get a list of everything they say, from commercials to ads in newspapers, to classifieds, to job ads, anything and all they find. And then we talk about how we might translate that to the time period in primary resource. So when they talk about during daytime TV, they might find a job ad for, say, being a nurse tech for Black women. We talk about how would we find jobs in the period that they're studying, most usually in the classifieds of a newspaper. So then I send them to that. You can find that, through databases online. And then I have them search in different time periods to see about what jobs were available for Black women, and what does that tell us about how Black women were thought about in the world? Are there any advertisements in which Black women are putting out job ads? And what does that say? Are they hiring? Do they own their own businesses, et cetera? And what does that say about how Black women are thinking about themselves in the world? Another example that a student brought up recently was a pamphlet on campus. We have a Black women's wellness group here at UT, and they had pamphlets all around with images of Black women and talking about what they were going to do in that particular group, right? So then we looked through to see what we could find online with digitized collections for Black women in student organizations for the time period in which that student wanted to work on a research project. So I hope this helps them see, that it's always happening in the world around them, but also how it translates or mutates as time goes on and what an archive of this might look like. So where can students find a lot of this information really easily? Two places that have been really, really beneficial for all of my students from undergraduates through graduate school is ProQuest Black Newspapers and ProQuest History Vault. So the Black newspapers, particularly in that instance when I was talking about, for example, the classified ads for jobs, is especially useful, but they put in a couple of different kinds of searches. So one might be for just classified and job ads, and you see those in the newspaper pages there. Sometimes we compare those with other digital databases that ProQuest also offers, like the Washington Post and the New York Times, to see what jobs or things are available for Black people versus white people. Also, the History Vault is really useful. So that example that I told you about with the campus flyers, students are able to put in different kinds of combinations of words, say like, campus flyer, campus meeting, women's group, women's liberation group, et cetera, and find, particular flyers, manifestos, things of that nature that might come from everything from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There might be something from the Black Panthers in there, anything that might have been collected by the government. is also often in there in the administrative files. So these are ways in which students can kind of play with those words and those ideas and find different kinds of sources. I think one of the things that is especially useful about the History Vault is that when they put in a search and they get kind of a proliferation of things back from different databases or different archival collections, they start to think about what intellectual production more broadly can look like, right? So they may have been in search of a flyer because the flyer is what they saw in the real world today, but in the process, they find a bunch of other things related to women's groups on campus, and they realize that these are all different expressions of intellectual production for Black women that they can use in their projects. So it becomes kind of an entry point in the digitization and database, really expands their imaginations. So I also want to talk about how this might work in the book that I'm currently working on, which is a book about Queen Mother Audley Moore. So just to give you the slightest bit of background, Queen Audley Moore was born in 1898 and she died in 1997. So she lived for almost a century. And her last appearance was at the Million Man March in 1995. So you can imagine I've got my work cut out for me and trying to go back until about the 1850s and come all the way up to about 1995, 1996 in terms of a history, right? This is made infinitely harder by the fact that Queen Mother Moore has no archive per se. And by that I mean is there is no place that I can go where her stuff is neatly connected, put in a finding aid, organized in folders, enfolding in her life. And this is a common circumstance for Black women, certainly Black radical women. And for somebody like Moore, who only had a third grade education and who translated most of her ideas orally or through speeches that may or may not have been recorded, it's an increasingly difficult task to be able to do. But as you can see from also this image of her, this is an image of her home with all the stuff around her. She also collected a lot of her stuff. And there's real questions about where that went. To this day, nobody knows. It's kind of a little bit of a national treasure hunt. Some people say it's in Ethiopia. Some people say it's in New Iberia. Some people say it left in a fire. I've met people that say they're wearing some of the stuff that you see in this picture. So it really is kind of a wild hunt to find and resurrect her life. So where do I have to start with somebody like Moore, who lived for so long but has no central database or way to do this? Unfortunately, for many people like me who were Black radicals, one of the most complete accountings we have is the government surveillance through COINTELPRO or counterintelligence files. I could offer you numerous examples of Black women radicals from the 20th century where almost day by day, there is somebody following them or trailing them, a federal agent, for the better part of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And they are not only offering you kind of a day by day thing of where they're going and what they're doing, they're also cutting out newspapers from local places where they give talks and creating kind of an archive within that government file. And so that is usually the database that we have to start and work at because it offers one of the most complete accountings of a life, as problematic as that is. And we can talk about perhaps strategies for helping students navigate those government files as well in the Q&A. But also we have to be suspicious of government files, right? The goal here was to dehumanize and discredit women like Moore. And the FBI followed her for the better part of 60 years. And so I have to cross-check that with what databases and information I have dealt together. But what that does allow me to do is to start to go into databases like ProQuest, go into databases like newspapers.com and say, well, I know that she was here from this date to this date in 1946. Where can I find more coverage, particularly coverage from the Black press, that might offer me a more balanced picture of Moore and what she was doing, right? So it goes from kind of COINTELPRO documents down to cross-checking in online and digital databases, to searching for her maybe in finding aids and on-site archival collections. But that is still exceedingly rare because most things people don't know were written by her, categorized by her. Also, her name is misspelled often, making it difficult to find. And so one of the things that I try to talk about when I'm thinking about how to navigate Moore is to think about an alternative understanding of archive in this particular moment. And this is something I also share with my students. So I call Moore's archive a disorderly distributed archive. And by that I mean is that her artifacts are strewn and literally located everywhere. We're talking everywhere, in Ghana, in London, in Australia, everywhere, right? Across multiple archival spaces. I've also been in people's basements. I've also been in people's attics. Like I said, I've met people that purport to be wearing some of the things that she has, right? And it is this kind of discordance where life is not neatly collected all together and organized by a finding aid that I think in large part has caused more to be overlooked, or to be said we can't write the history of Moore because we don't have sources. So what many people are calling archival lack really is a lack of organization. But it becomes a problem in particular when we take the geography or the geospatial arrangement of her archives as discordant or disjointed or legible. And then we then apply that to Black women like Moore and say, well, if there's nothing neatly organized, if there's no way to make coherence out of her life in the frameworks that we understand as archive, then she must not have had a real theory, right? She must not be a real intellectual. She must not have a set of thoughts that she promulgated throughout her life. And that's not in fact the case. It just requires a different way of getting at her thoughts and ideas and drawing out that legibility over the better part of the century. So what I'm really counteracting here is not necessarily a thing of archival lack, as many people have said, but really a disorderly distributed archive, or one that isn't neatly put together. So then the question becomes, how do we work backwards again, right? And here is where databases in particular are really, really useful. In fact, I don't know that I could have completed this project without that, right? So the first then, after I've gone from the COINTELPRO records, where I'm trying to figure out just the who, what, where, when, and why of where she was, the next step is to try to put that into actual databases and see if I can find corroboration from the FBI files into something that stimulates what she was actually doing, what she was saying, you know, corroborating that kind of timeline with another set of sources, right? And so that's really useful for figuring out what Moore did and where she was and who she was talking to and maybe the causes that she was a part of. But as I said, I'm an intellectual historian, so I'm not just interested in what Moore did, but I'm really interested in what she thought and how that shapes the world around her. So in order to get at that, it gets a little bit more complicated than just using snippets from newspapers, right? So from that, I have to get to basically what I call a keyword map, where I take the things that I see repeated in reports about where she was and what she did through newspaper articles over the years and create a list, right? For Moore, it would be something like reparations, which she is the mother of the reparations movement. So I might have a list of primary source articles that just say, Queen Mother Audley Moore is here to give a talk about reparations. Queen Mother Moore is on the radio to talk about reparations, etc. So I make a list of things like that. I make a list of the groups that they say that she was a part of, because none of these groups have membership roles and a lot of them don't have, you know, formal archives, as it were. And then I go back into primary sources, particularly something like the History Vault that has archives digitized, and put in those words and try to find what I can around her in the hopes of maybe happening upon her in a different way. So this looks a little bit, you know, to give you a sense of kind of the keyword mind map in action. You might start with something like Queen Mother Audley Moore, civil rights leader, dies at 98, right? This is an article taken from the Washington Times through ProQuest that offers basically an obituary of her life, right? I can corroborate that with things that I found in the COINTELPRO file. But as long as I find a list of these things, I get out keywords. The keywords that I found most specifically, like I said, were reparations, self-determination. She was a big factor in that. And so she's espousing theories of Black nationalism. The Universal Negro Improvement Association. This is Marcus Garvey's group, for which she was a member and an ideological adherent for the better part of the 20th century. And then the Queen Mother Moore School. I saw a school popping up everywhere, right? So then I take all of these things, I put them into other primary databases and go into finding aids, some that are online, some that are in person. And there I'm able to find another set of primary sources, such as this one called Why Reparations, which is one of her actual writings about the reparations movement, about her historical and intellectual justification for reparations, and then her plans for reparations, like how would this look? What would that do? And that third piece is what I'm really interested in looking at as an intellectual historian. What were her thoughts about reparations? How did she analyze it? What thoughts did she put into the world? And then I go back to the primary sources to see how it was received in the world and her kind of intellectual influence. So this is another example of how I kind of have to do this a little bit backwards because there isn't a neatly kind of set of archives there. To offer you another example of how this works is that I saw a lot of examples from ProQuest newspapers about her role in the school boycotts in New York in the 1960s, right? So that's another thing I put into databases just to see what would come up. And one of the really great rare finds that I found was a folder. It was labeled 1966 school boycotts, but the only thing in the folder was a poem written by Queen Mother Moore that was performed the night of a school protest. So nowhere in that form or anywhere in that finding aid or anywhere in kind of the flagging was her name, but I had to know to go to the different themes that she might've been a part of and kind of keep researching around. And I'm not sure why it wasn't categorized that way, but that would have missed a rare find to offer a poetry as another form of her intellectual production that I missed. So then how might this look when we try to repeat it in the classroom for students who are trying to do Black women's intellectual history? And so, if you have students pick a particular topic or a particular woman, let's say, for example, Claudia Jones, who was a Black radical who lived in Harlem and then was deported to London from the 1940s and 1950s, right? I would ask students to put this into a database and just to get a set of articles that both tell the student kind of the who, what, where, when, and why of that woman's life, Claudia Jones's wife, but also to start to basically code it for keywords, the things that Jones might have been a part of, right? Now, obviously, students aren't going to write about everything. Usually they need to pick one kind of smaller thing for a research paper. And so from that keyword set of databases, I have them narrow it down to a topic. Perhaps they want to talk about Claudia Jones and her issues of immigration. Claudia Jones came from Trinidad. She was deported because she was allegedly in violation for being a communist under the Smith Act. So that's something that they can kind of trace throughout and do a solid research project on, where she wrote a lot about what it means to be an immigrant, right? From there, they take those terms or those words or any groups that she might have been associated with and put them into the databases or into online finding aids for these key terms. And then they have to kind of search through and see what they can find. As with Moore, students find writings from her jail cell where she was sitting and being deported, waiting to be deported. They find plenty of information about her life after she left the United States and was deported to London. They find poetry and songs that she wrote, and they're able to put that in the context of understanding what Jones was using these different forms and formats for, to talk about what her thoughts in the world, about race, about immigration, about class, and formulate a research project from there. So if we're thinking back to my original animating questions about how 20th century Black women radicals shaped the past and present understandings of politics, liberation, and equality, and we're talking about how does one locate and analyze Black women's intellectual production, I hope you come away with a couple of key things that we can talk about more today. First is never assume that something doesn't exist. I always tell students and researchers that there's a way in which we often say, well, we know that there's biases in collections. We know that there's biases in class, race, gender. And we know that Black women's lives and ideas are not collected at the same rates or as white men and white women. But that doesn't mean that it does not exist. It may just mean that it's not going to be categorized and organized in the ways in which you have to approach it, where you're studying a subject for which we have more of a basis for archival approaches. And the truth be told, I think in some ways that's better. There's a lot of opportunities that open up when we study Black women, not under the guise of an already completed archive or one that's really easily accessible and ordered. It allows for students to not be confined to particular organization or to particular narration of their lives and ideas. And it also asks students to think more broadly about what constitutes evidence for them. So then, so one is not to assume there's archival lack. The second thing that they really have to come away with is the idea that, evidence has to look different because of what Black women were and weren't allowed to do and what they were and weren't allowed to say. It is possible that you're going to find somebody, say, if you're studying the period I do, like an Angela Davis or Kathleen Neal Cleaver, where the speeches and writings are recorded and are continuing to be recorded to understand their thoughts clearly. But more often than not, that's not going to be the case. So how then, in the period in which you're studying, were Black women engaging in the world? And how then, in the period in which you were studying, would they been able to express that? Maybe, satire and art was seen as an okay expression of Black women's politics in a way that writing a strongly worded treatise combating sexism was not. So how can we look for that for expressions of Black women's politics, right? And then the third thing that they need to be able to do is to not be afraid of different interpretations of Black women's organizing. And here I'm talking about using in particular government records and surveillance records. It is certainly a double-edged sword to enter into a Black woman's life or a Black woman's thoughts from the vantage points of the white surveillance state. But if used properly as a source, it can be a great kind of entry point into talking about and finding and nailing down all the different things Black women were doing, because there is probably no better accounting of some of these women than that, because traditional modes were not available to them. So in summary, I want to maybe think about how we can talk about archives in a disorderly way, talk about the promise of these disorderly distributed archives, and talk about how we can help students navigate these different ways of organizing and thinking about Black women's thoughts. So I think that I will stop there and maybe we can get into some questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. That was really fascinating. I'm sure the attendees are going to walk away with some really great ideas on how to help their student researchers at their institutions. And we do have several questions. So
Okay.
The first one is, any chance of an audiobook version of Remaking Black Power being produced?
I would hope, as many of you know about academic books, they have to get to a certain level of sales before a press would even consider that. And we're not there yet. So I'm not sure, but hopeful in the future.
Okay, great. Second question, when did Ms. Childress produce the column and how many years was it published?
That's a great question. So Alice Childress, who also has a prolific FBI file as well, was a writer and a playwright and a producer of this column. It ran from about 1950 to 1955, first in a newspaper called Freedom, which was created by Paul Robeson, but he had to go underground because of ideas about communism and his communist links. And then it got picked up by the Baltimore African American as a Black newspaper in the area. And they repeated some of those columns and Childress continued to write about them. We have collected them all and you can find them in a book called Conversations from Life. And I think in Conversations from Life, they're serialized in order, but it really is a remarkable kind of source, because I mean, when I tell you that Mildred, the main character, is talking about everything from, I was on the way home from work, scrubbing white women's floors, and I passed this Black nationalist thing, right? I was at Sunday school, and the kids were talking about all of the people in Black history, but they never honored any Black women, right? And they're all relayed, like I said, over the phone to her friend named Marge. So you really get a sense of them bantering back and forth as representatives of Black working class women in that particular political moment.
Cool. We're getting lots of questions now. So one comment is, I wonder to what hang on, I lost it. Let me get back up here. I wonder to what degree some of her disorderliness and dispersion was intentional to keep their items out of the hands of institutional archives, which were often foundationally based on or meant to uphold traditional white supremacist narratives. And yeah, that one's it's got to be about the Queen Mother.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you brought that up. So what's really interesting that you find a lot about Black women, particularly radicals in the 20th century, is kind of like W.B. Du Bois. They recognized their own importance. I mean, for example, W.B. Du Bois collected everything of himself, right? Why we have, 3 volumes of biography on him is largely because he was a bibliophile of his own life, right? Queen Mother Moore was also. But the issue here is that there was never a move from all the stuff that was collected, even some of that stuff that I showed you in the picture. There was no place that wanted to take it as she was getting older. I have interviewed multiple people who have said tried to donate it to different spaces, and they didn't really realize her importance. And part of that has to do with the idea that she was a Black working class woman, and what could she have done, right? If she wasn't giving these speeches and she wasn't writing these books, that she must have not been as important, even though we all know that she was. So I think Moore really wanted for her legacy to be preserved. And at the end of her life, she actually tried to raise money to create her own kind of archive for it, but that never happened. And then, like I said, there's real questions about what happened afterwards. I said, some people say a fire, some people say they ransacked the place, some people say it was taken to Ethiopia. It really is the stuff of lore and legend. But I'm glad that you bring up this question about what disorderly distribution offers Black women, particularly Black radical women. So what I do think it offers is a little bit of privacy and lack of surveillance in a life that was largely surveilled, you know, from, say, for more example, the 20s to the 80s, right? It offers a moment for them to not have their whole lives on display and not have their lives judged and narrated in a way that typically was not good for Black women, particularly women like her that were on the fringes of politics and discourse then. Mm-hmm. So I do think that even if it wasn't intentional, it does offer some sort of cover in their afterlives. And certainly it offers a lot of cover for their personal lives, which they very much tried to keep protected, both for fear of stereotypes about Black women, but also for fear for safety of their families.
Great. Okay, so would you also be able to repeat where the piece Why Reparations appeared? You did mention the source.
Yeah, so it is, now you can actually find it in a ProQuest database, but before it used to be housed in a library in Northern California, the Freedom Archives. And so it was a pamphlet that she wrote in 1963, but it was interspersed within a bunch of other stuff just related largely under the kind of, the folder name was just reparations. And that's because she was seen as and actively engaged in jumpstarting the idea of reparations in the late 1950s and early 60s. So she traveled from place to place trying to garner support for this. And one of the places where she got a lot of buy-in was in Northern and Southern California, where they actually tried to create reparations claims. And so, like I said, now it can be found online. But originally it was just an archive titled Reparations, because whoever was cataloging it didn't necessarily see her name as a name that it should be flagged in terms of the finding aid.
When doing the keyword searching across sources, how do you decide when you have enough evidence? Yourself as a researcher, but also how do you guide students with this question?
Listen, I mean, so for Black women's history, we do a lot with a very little. I often tell my students, if you think about, you know, we're talking about the 20th century and the late 20th century here, right? Historians of, for example, enslaved women do a lot with one slave sale, right? So there's always enough if you're willing to look and you're willing to think about and interpret sources well. But I would say if they've got at least 4 or 5 like solid pieces, that is of what we would term intellectual production, or something that they can analyze for evidence of intellectual production, that would be considered a boon in a lot of cases, just because so much of this is either somewhere that we haven't figured out how to locate, or it maybe has been lost.
Okay, and we have several people here interested in your comments about collections related to church activities and records and Black sorority records.
Yeah, so, you know, the church records are a boon for many, many reasons. Just to give you an example again from Queen Mother Moore, she has no birth certificate because in 1898 in Louisiana, they didn't track Black births. But the church, the Catholic church that she was born into, has a baptismal certificate that you can find at her local parish in New Iberia, New Orleans. So churches are really vital for you know, figuring out the biographical details, marriages, deaths, et cetera, of a woman that you may not be able to find somewhere else. They also are places that collect a lot of work or a lot of pamphlets around community organizing. And we know that Black women at the local level in particular were the ones that were primarily engaged in this kind of work. So maybe there's not a speech that is published in the newspaper like the Black Panther, but maybe there is a collection of that speech when the woman was available to come to Women's Day at the church. Same goes for sororities and women's groups. To take Queen Mother as an example again, she found a great intellectual home in the 1940s and 50s in the women's club movement. And the women's club movement is notoriously very conservative to kind of moderate, not at all her set of politics in terms of Black nationalism, but it was a space that was allowed for Black women to come and talk freely, where if she put out a cause, Black women would come and show up. And so I have found many instances of her in kind of the logs of sororities or the logs of women's movement proceedings or conferences offering speeches, right? That would never be cataloged usually with her name, but if you knew that she went to that particular conference from finding those articles, you could then search through the proceedings for that particular year at a church, for that particular year at a sorority, for that particular year at a women's movement or convention. And often you might find something that you wouldn't normally find otherwise.
Great. And we have several librarians that would like to know how librarians can better support scholars researching Black women's knowledge production.
You know, this is a tough thing. So I mean, you know, one thing that I teach a class in graduate school, and I have students examine a finding aid. And when they look at the finding aid, they realize how much the conventions of archival processing have led to a very kind of white male patriarchal understanding of how we categorize things. So one thing that can really help is to kind of create more expansive finding aids and more expansive ways of doing keyword searches, adding keywords to things, or flagging documents or collections for things that might not be in the finding aid, so that when we search for them or when we come to you, they say, you know, I am searching Black women in the 1960s in Austin, Texas. Well, if you have familiarity, you might say, well, you know, this is labeled X, Y, and Z, but here you might find information about that. Second is, as much as we can make these sources more readily available, the better. I mean, I know that there is there's huge questions of processing and backlog. There's huge questions about copyright in terms of digitizing and putting things online. But we also know that most researchers of color don't typically have the same kind of means, both in time and money, to go from place to place to place to do this kind of research. So the more that we can make those things accessible, the better, and the more histories that we're able to produce. And then finally, a key thing I think would be really helpful for librarians is oral histories in their particular area. We really could all use more accounts and primary accounts of Black women in particular areas or circumstances. And I think that especially if you work at a public library or university library, there might be more of an investment in doing those kind of longstanding oral histories within the community. And those also are typically where we find more instances of Black women than kind of top-down organizational histories or archives.
Okay, can you share your thoughts on building traditional archival collections of these materials? Do you think it's something a traditionally white-centric institution should work to build, or is it better left to be held in the community and referred to in work such as yours?
It's a great question. So, I mean, before any kind of, well, let me say this. I would say that a key part of understanding acquisition here has to be your relationship with the community in question. For example, taking back Remaking Black Power, I did almost 40 interviews, and Harvard asked me to put those in the Schlesinger Library, for example. But as I tried to navigate the permissions from the women who I did the interviews with and match them with the institutional means and demands that Harvard was asking for, it turned out to be such a complicated and, for me, ethically fraught thing to do that I abandoned the project. And that in part was because I, as a scholar, did not have the ability and wherewithal to help them navigate that, but also and kind of navigate the permissions and what that would mean for them. But also it was because there was a real mistrust, right, of white-centered institutions and the way they've treated Black people in the past. And so I think that one thing, if that's going to happen, because we know that these kinds of places have way more resources than community groups, is that there needs to be more of a concerted effort in both repairing the relationships between the communities, but also possibly having somebody that can really help community members navigate what it means to place these things in these institutions and kind of be a steward in that way. And there's great groups that do this. There's a group, for example, in Chicago called the Blackavist. And they do this kind of work. They're all archivists by training at different jobs, but this is the kind of stewarding that they do to help people kind of make these repair in these communities. If instead, which is the ideal, is that it stays in the community, then what institutions that are better resourced or predominantly white institutions can do is support that creation. And I think that can happen two ways. One is just creating partnerships where perhaps it stays in the community resource that is more accessible, but maybe they borrow items to put up, in exhibits, et cetera, in the larger predominantly white institution. Or there needs to be a way, perhaps, if possible, to digitize, to make a backup. Another example I'll give you of how important this I feel is that there's a wonderful activist that I feature in my book named Gwen Patton. She's a tried and true activist from Alabama. And so she rightfully wants all of her stuff at a place called Trentholm State Tech University, which is a community college in Alabama. That's where you have to go if you want to look at this stuff. But as you can imagine, that school does not get the same kind of resources as the University of Alabama, as Tuskegee there, and many of the other places, owing to being a small community school. So, and if something were to happen to those archives, all of that would be lost. So we could still keep the originals there, but if we had a way to digitize them so that at least there was a second copy, that would help not only make it more accessible because it's a difficult place to get to, but also make sure that those kind of vulnerable archives survive while still keeping them in the community and honoring the wishes of those that created them.
Nice. So when you talk about the FBI files you looked at, are you referring to the FBI Records Vault, which is a government docs site, it looks like, based on the URL that's provided here, or are there other resources you also use?
Yeah, so I'm talking about any surveillance at the state or federal level. So some of these things can be found on the vault. What they do there is the things that they get Freedom of Information or FOIA requests for the most, they put there. So like a Malcolm X, right, will always be there. A Marcus Garvey will always be there. An Al Capone will be there. But I'm also talking about records that I have gotten through the Freedom of Information Act from the federal government that come to me over time. They're also heavily redacted, right? And then I'm also talking about police records, right? Local level law enforcement records. Red Squad records would be another example, places that, particularly in Chicago, San Francisco, New York, where local police forces are documenting how they're trying to quote unquote stamp out leftists and communists. So I'm talking about that broad range there. Some of these things have been archived in other places. For example, there's an activist named Ella Baker. You can find her FBI file in her archive. And some have been digitized, but it's a range of records that I'm speaking to there.
Okay. Trying to find the one we've got several votes on. So let's see. Can you provide some of your top choices for online finding aids on this topic?
On the topic of Black women's history or radical history? It's a great question. I don't know that I could do that off the top of my head because there's not a ton. But one system that I think is especially effective is the link to all the California archives, the OAC. It offers a way of searching all the archives that are members of that, whether that be like the Southern California Library, which is a small community library in LA, to like Stanford University's archive, which is huge, right? Any archive that is in California. And you can put in different keywords that way. So you can find things across different archives as well. So that would be one example of an online archive that I think does a good job of showing the range of possibilities of what you can get. But as far as finding aids of actual Black women online, they're very few.
Okay. Here's another FBI file question. So one person is interested in doing research on Stephanie St. Clair, aka Queenie, who was a numbers boss during the Prohibition era in Harlem. Not much has been written about her. I only know of one book, which I haven't read yet. How do you go about finding her FBI file?
Yeah, great question. So you should definitely look at LaShawn Harris's book, which is the main one that's been written about her. I do think there's another biography in the works as well. that you could probably Google around and find. So first step I would do is take to the back of LaShawn Harris's book and find if she actually has the FBI file. One of the things that is difficult about requesting things from the FBI is that they lag sometimes months to years behind. But if something has already been released to somebody else and that researcher has it, you will save yourself years of waiting by just seeing if they'll offer you a copy of it. If not, then you need to fill out a Freedom of Information Act request. And there are different kind of agencies you have to do that to. One would certainly be the FBI. Another would probably be the New York Police Department. And this requires going online. There's typically an email that you do. They have a form letter that you put in. And you put in the information for what you're looking for, and you wait to see what comes back. It will be a very long wait and a very long process. And the third thing would be probably to see, particularly in New York, in the different bureaus, archives, see what you can find about police records or arrest records there. Those would be books that they would take off the shelf and be able to show you. And that'd be a lot faster than requesting things from the US government.
Certainly. Okay. I love hearing about your search process and working with students. Have you ever had students identify sources or ways of searching for these materials that surprised you?
That's a good question. It's difficult to say off the top of my head. I mean, but the students come up with some inventive stuff. I mean, or inventive readings. I mean, it's really, it is amazing what opens up to them when you basically challenge them to see almost everything as a source about Black women or by Black women, right? What does it tell us? What does it not? So definitely seen them do campus flyers. I've seen them do poetry. I've seen them do art. I've seen them do a map, which was interesting, which they had a map of a protest where they had the route along which the protest was going to go in DC and where they were going to stop. And they researched each of those stops to talk about what that might have meant to stand in front of those particular edifices as Black women, or what kind of image of Black womanhood they were trying to portray by stopping at those different places. That's probably one of the more interesting ones I've found.
Yeah, nice. How do you discuss archival genre conventions with your students? When it comes to archives and research, a poem and a manual both function differently, for example.
What was the first part of the question again?
How do you discuss archival genre conventions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I asked them to think about the conditions in which each would have been made. That's step one. Like, so when is it from, right? So let's say we have a poem in 1930 and a poem in 1960. When is it from? What are the historical conditions out of which such a poem would have arose, right? The next question is audience. Did the audience for a manual, particularly like that manual I talked about in my presentation, was really meant for other women in that particular organization that followed that particular ideology or understanding of Black nationalism, but a bit of less use to someone that wasn't in that group, right? Whereas a poem might have a much broader audience and be interested in convincing women that weren't a part of that group that their group was the best group to be in to get to Black liberation, right? So still the same subject matter, but the audience and intent is really different there. So that's a real question that students have to figure out. What is the hope and dream of kind of intellectual influence, and who are they looking to influence and why? And I think those kinds of questions help them really understand, why people are using that particular form and what that means for how the ideas about Black women are being spread.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question, although there are several here that we haven't had a chance to answer, but I will ask Dr. Farmer to answer these questions, and we'll post them out to everyone who just signed up, maybe couldn't attend today, because there are really good questions here, and I just thank you all for taking the time to write them. So last question, how persistent are students prepared to be when searching digital archives? Are they ready to try different spellings, or do they tend to consider the metadata that digital publishers provide infallible?
We talk a lot about that because obviously digital archives are not without other sets of issues. So we usually do a troubleshooting class. I leave room for this because there's issues. So the number one issue, for example, they usually have is they go in and they put the word Black or African American in it, and they come back and say, I can't find anything, right? And you're like, well, that's because the term has changed, right, over time. So you've got to put in Negroes, right? Or you've got to put in colored. And so usually they go and they do kind of an initial search. They come back and they're frustrated, and then we brainstorm as a group how you might get around it. And we offer different ideas and spellings, but they have to learn to do that. There's no other way to get enough of what they need. So it's not typically something I find that they're able to get to on their own. But as soon as we kind of come back as a group and talk about it, they're like, oh, that makes sense. And they will go back and try it again, if nothing else, because they can't complete their assignment without it.
Yeah. So literally there are another 20 questions here. So thank you very much. But any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to make, Ashley?
Yeah, well, I mean, just thank you everybody for coming, you know, and being willing to listen and engage in these different ways of approaching this. I find it really exciting, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to ask students to think really differently about archive, artifact, and research process in really generative ways. So I hope it was helpful in thinking about your own processes as well.
Yeah, I want to thank you as well for the time you took to prepare and being willing to do this with us. We really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy woman, but thank you all to all of you who attended today, registered today, and thank you for your engagement with your questions, and be reassured we will answer them all for you, and we look forward to seeing you on a future ProQuest ACRL webinar. Thanks very much, everyone, and stay safe out there. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.